we as Americans have the capacity now, as we've had in the past, to do whatever needs to be done to preserve this last and greatest bastion of freedom. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Listen to my man, Ronald Reagan. Government is always the problem. And think about it. When's the last time the government did something without screwing it all up? Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Cowboy State Politics. I'm your host, David Iverson, broadcasting to you from the base of the Bighorns in beautiful Buffalo, Wyoming. We've got a great show for you tonight, a really special guest that I'll introduce here in a minute. But before we get there, you can find everything Cowboy State Politics on the website, cowboystatepolitics.com. You can listen to the podcast on any of your favorite apps, iTunes, Pandora, TuneIn, any of those. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button. But I think that's probably enough self-promotion for right now. On with the show. Wyoming just elected its fifth Libertarian congressman to the House of Representatives, and the first since 2002. His name's Marshall Burt from around Rock Springs. But it occurred to me that most people really don't know anything about the Libertarian Party or what it means to be a libertarian. Libertarians get blasted as anarchists that don't want any sort of government whatsoever, or as right-wing extremists that don't think that there should be any restrictions on freedom, and that's just not the case. To put it simply, libertarians believe in the least amount of government interference possible. I'm a registered Republican, and the reason for that is so that I can actually vote in all the elections. But really, I'm a libertarian in the sense of John Stuart Mill. Now, we've talked about it a couple times on the program, that I think that the only acceptable use of government authority or power is to prevent harm to another person. That's called the harms principle. And it's at this point that we begin our discussion with Chris Spangle, one of the leading voices in the libertarian movement. So here's our interview from last week. I hope you enjoy it. I'm joined today by Chris Spangle. Chris is the founder of the We Are Libertarians Network. He's a 15-year veteran of politics and media. He also is the digital director for a nationally syndicated morning radio show that you might have heard of, The Bob and Tom Show. And he was the executive director of the Libertarian Party of Indiana. Chris, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me on.
So where I wanted to start is just kind of in general, how did you arrive at being a libertarian?
Well, I started falling in love with politics as a kid, and I think it started listening to Rush Limbaugh in my grandma's Mazda Miata as she would yell about the liberals as a kid as she drove me around, and then got really into the Clinton impeachment. And I was from a Republican family, and so I was very all for him getting impeached. And I remember skipping a movie, for instance, to sit in the car and listen to the Senate acquit him, essentially. I thought it was high drama, not knowing that the outcome had already been predetermined. And then went to Washington, D.C. on that 6th grade field trip, and just it was just such a cool experience, and always loved history and politics. And then I really got involved in politics in the Republican Party when 9/11 happened. I was 18. I turned 18 2 days before 9/11. And it was just foundation shaking for me in so many different ways. And so really got involved in politics, started volunteering for Republican campaigns, went on to be the chairman of the College Republicans in 2004 at my college. And we were looking for a campaign to work with, and went to work for a guy named Andy Horning. And he was running for Congress, and he was a libertarian. And wasn't the first time I'd heard the word. The first time I'd heard the word was on Neil Boortz, because I was a big talk radio fan. And when he told me what a libertarian was, we got a chance to talk a lot about it, and was very foundational in teaching me a lot about libertarianism and politics. and then went to work at a talk radio station. And the host was fairly libertarian. His name was Abdul Hakim Shabazz, and he started picking apart all my Rush Limbaugh arguments. And I realized I didn't really know a lot about what I was saying. Like, I was just talking out of my behind. And he ended up, excuse me, I have COVID. So he, it started to do a lot of research, and I decided to start calling myself a libertarian. The one thing I couldn't get my head around was the foreign policy stuff, because obviously after 5 years of being a Bushy, it was like, well, I can't think this way because of these reasons. And Ron Paul in the debates against Rudy Giuliani really helped kind of seal that deal. So ended up going on to work for the Libertarian Party of Indiana. They were pretty ineffective. And I said, why? And they said, we don't have an executive director. And I said, well, you can't pay me less than I'm making now at the radio station. So I ended up doing that for 4 years, and haven't looked back since. I mean, I really, finding libertarianism really was a game changer. I mean, it was like, I knew I didn't quite fit in the Republican Party. I'd almost gotten impeached for thinking that gay marriage was fine and that immigration needed to be reformed, according to what Bush said. And the other Republicans just were like, who, right, what kind of freak are you?
Well, around here we say, if you're not a liberal when you're 20, you don't have a heart, and if you're not a conservative by the time you're 40, you don't have a brain. So maybe maybe we ought to define for our listeners what exactly a libertarian is. Why don't you give me your definition, and then I'll respond.
I mean, really, it's the rules that you were taught as a kid. Don't hit people. Don't take other people's stuff. Don't lie. Don't cheat. Don't steal. It's really about treating other people like you want to be treated, and not hurting them. And those are the basic rules of society. And the government doesn't abide by those rules because inherently it forces people to do what other people want them to do. If you don't pay your taxes, or if you don't obey some law, you go to jail, you get fined out of existence. That's force. And so we use the government to force people to do certain things as opposed to persuading them. And it should be voluntary. So I'm all for arranging society in the moral ways that we were taught as kids, as opposed to saying one thing and doing another as adults. I completely agree.
I mean, that's basically Milton Friedman's definition of being a libertarian is. For me, I got interested in politics when I joined the speech and debate team in high school, and reading John Stuart Mill's On Liberty was a revelation for me. That the only acceptable use of force is to prevent harm to another person. Other than that, we need to have as limited government as possible. And I think that, well, actually, let me get to my second question here, because I think it kind of dovetails. You and I have a lot more in common than I initially realized. I don't mean to out you, but we're both working on finishing a history degree. And interestingly enough, the only class I have left is also Spanish. But I think that knowledge is a prerequisite to liberty. Our founders, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, they were pretty much all self-educated people. For the most part. Admittedly, they were brilliant, but self-educated people created one of the greatest liberty documents in history, in my opinion. Now, I think that, and I listened to your podcast about the student debt crisis, so that's kind of where I'm going with this. I think that tyranny comes in a lot of different forms, maybe tyranny with a little t, perhaps. One of those is in education. People say that you have to get a degree, but that comes at the cost of trillions of dollars in student debt and a huge crop of uneducated young people. So what in your opinion is a libertarian free market solution to, one, educating people, and two, more generally, for the student debt crisis?
Well, education, I mean, it's tough because it's a two-part solution. And libertarians are really good at the first part, which is get government out of everything. And so they're very good at kind of articulating what we need to do to make sure that the government doesn't continue to mess certain things up. they're very poor at the second part, which is talking about what we ought to do on the other side of that.
Right, absolutely.
And so, and I call myself the chief offender on that a lot of times. And so, the first step is to start rolling back what we've done. I mean, the Department of Education, for instance, has cost billions of dollars, and it's not improved test scores. It's only improved. It's only proven to put in place these standards that rob teachers of the ability to do their God-given gift of teaching children. If you talk to a teacher, they're so miserable because they don't have the freedom to teach. There's teaching to tests and to standards. And it wasn't that way when I was in school 20 years ago. Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of crept up since No Child Left Behind. Well, George Bush, because he felt he was on tenuous ground because of the 2000 election, felt that he had to have some bipartisan piece of legislation to unite the country, worked with Teddy Kennedy, passed No Child Left Behind, passed all these standards. That's blossomed over time into things like Common Core, and it's robbed the spirit of education in local school districts because it's all centralized. And so now you have administrators and teachers who are just very unhappy with what they're doing. And so start removing some of that stuff. Removing the 535 people in Washington, D.C. shouldn't have authority over local school districts and parents locally. It's really up to the local administrators and teachers to plot out what they're doing. And that's the first step. And removing that power, returning power back to local authority, letting people find new solutions, lifting restrictions that kind of keep educators and school districts in the same sort of rote system of memorization that we have. And that's one of the beautiful things about the school choice movement, which leads us to the second part, is that Indianapolis is a hotbed of school choice. I have on my wall the books of Friedman because I brought a bunch of people to a Friedman Foundation event. Its headquarters here. It's a Milton Friedman Foundation built on school choice. That's headquarters here. The Lumina Foundation, all of these different groups are here in Indianapolis working on school choice and new models of education. And Democrats and Republicans here locally and statewide are all for it. They work together because they go, whatever we were doing was not working. We need to find new solutions. And time again, it's the federal government and their mandates that are getting in their way. And, Mayor Bart Peterson, a Democrat, spearheaded the charter school movement here in Indianapolis. A Democrat was the only one that was going to get that done. And what that did is it brought so much competition. Now, the charter school movement has some mixed reviews here locally, but it put so much pressure on IPS and the local school district that they created what was called innovation schools. My niece goes to one of these. And so now you have different models of education. She's in one that focuses on nature. There's one that has programming on art. And it's really helping children learn in the way that they learn best. And so the innovation schools in the public school system, they're autonomous schools from even the IPS board, but they're funded through that, have been revolutionary for the students in Indianapolis. And it starts there, and then on to college. When you look at what broke college, it's two things. First, it is the backing of student loans based on the federal government saying we'll pay whatever it costs. Well, then why are we paying it back?
Exactly right.
And then secondly, they guaranteed student loans, which raised tuition. And then secondly, they started to push states through Obamacare to fund schools more and more, or to fund healthcare more and more, I should say, state Medicaid and Medicare. And what that did is that shrunk the pool of available money for state schools and state higher education, and that rose tuition as well. And so when you look at the root causes of why things are expensive or why people are stuck at a certain level, it usually trickles back to bad policy. And once you start peeling back that bad policy and letting people innovate, like we've seen in Indianapolis, you get great results.
I couldn't agree more. See, I mean, in Wyoming, we're blessed to have a pretty independent education system. In the high schools, they're not completely, but they're funded by county government through extractive industries, mineral royalties. So if you travel around Wyoming and visit different high schools, they're very different depending upon the community that they happen to be in. The one that's here in Buffalo, Wyoming, I mean, we have a fantastic school, and I think that aside from the federal mandates, teachers are fairly free to to do what they do best, and that's teach. And also, we have a pretty good community college system here. In fact, one of them was part of what they call a district here, and they just decided, because of COVID actually, to become privately funded. So right now the state is working on getting that college out of this district so that they can just completely be privately funded. And I think that's one of the advantages of living in a small state where we can have local control over education.
And the biggest villains across the board are teachers unions. I mean, they are the ones that, and teachers, when you say that, teachers are the enemy, and that's not the case at all. It's the unions, and I know the unions are looking out for the best interest of children, but they in Indiana have fought progress at every step of the way, and they have essentially manipulated and lied to teachers about what legislation that would offer up school choice means. And what it means is more freedom, more choice in the classroom for a teacher to do what they do best and the way that they do it best. Regulations or better, less regulations on administrators that causes them a lot of grief, and more job options because there's more places to teach, and that competition raises salaries. But instead they fight to keep schooling public. They fight to keep a monopoly on education, and that keeps wages repressed. And then you look at the COVID era, and really, I mean, this kind of makes libertarians uncomfortable when I say this, but it's the truth. Schools are, for lower income families, absolutely life-saving organizations, because this is where most of the direct care for the kids takes place. When COVID hit, there were a lot of kids that weren't eating, and school districts had to start putting buses together. Every nonprofit that I've talked to in town on my radio show called Now Hear This, that works with kids in schools, had to transition to feeding kids and dropping off. Like, there was this one charity called 913 Sports that was taking cycling into schools and teaching kids about cycling, and they had to stop that program and start delivering food with all of their available trailers because kids weren't getting that breakfast and lunch. Now, we can look at that and say that's not the government's responsibility, and of course it's not, but we also have to look and go, what are the ways that we have allowed a system to grow that causes such poverty that schools are the only way that kids get reliable meals? Where do we need to fix local, state, and federal policy that keeps people in those cycles of poverty? And then you look at the rise in child abuse. The only way that we know that child abuse is on the rise during COVID is because there are more kids who are dying of abuse in hospitals. And all of those kids who had that safety net of going to a teacher or watching the trends of their behavior by a teacher or a school counselor, all that dried up too.
Absolutely tragic.
And there's a ton of tragedy that has taken place by shutting down schools. And the people that shut down schools, in the face of all of the evidence that school spreads very minimal and does not affect people, it's at the hands of the teachers union. So I never want to hear another teachers union talk about being woke and how they care about the underprivileged. And I get that they had a Sophie's choice of, do we protect our teachers from COVID or do we protect those students from more abuse and hunger? But they chose the teachers, and it was a horrible mistake, and it needs to be rectified in every school district. The grades of children are suffering. We've essentially set kids back an entire year by closing down schools. There's ways to open it safely. There's ways to do schooling safely that protects the older teachers. With hybrid learning, it's about innovation. And I've seen in the nonprofit sector through this show, massive amounts of innovation. We've seen in the restaurant industry and other industries, a ton of innovation this year. Where we haven't seen a lot of innovation is public schooling. And that's because they're not allowed to. And who's responsible for that? Teachers unions. And it's madness, and it needs to come to an end. And I think that what COVID has done is clarified the need for government in a lot of areas. If we needed the red tape cut at the FDA and all these other places, why do we need to keep it? Get rid of it. And this is where it's really been driven home. I mean, children are really struggling with their education. Lower income families are struggling to put food on the table because one parent has to stay home. Women, like half, I think the statistic I said is like half of women in the United States have had some job affected or some income affected by this. And if you're a single mother and you're in that 50%, I mean, how are you doing it right now? So it's really a tough time, and you have to lay a lot of that at the feet of the teachers.
I absolutely 100% agree that, teachers unions are the biggest part of the problem. Now, one of the, I know you, maybe not nationally, but if you watch the news here, all of it is Wyoming has a huge spike in coronavirus, which I guess if you look at the population and compare it to the cases, yep, there's a spike going on. But where it's not happening is in the schools. By and large,
right,
they've been pretty successful at finding creative ways to control. I don't know if you can say that they were controlling the virus, but minimizing the spread inside the school. And I mean, locally, I think our school staff needs a big attaboy for that, or attagirl, as it were. One of the problems that we ran into here locally is when all the CARES funding came in, it was the administrators that got the largest amount of that money. And surprise, surprise, right? When you put an administrator in charge of a big lump sum, what are they going to do? Now, I have another question that kind of fits with that. Over the weekend, I judged our local high school speech and debate tournament. And the topic was, should the federal government provide a jobs guarantee? Now, out of the dozen or so kids that I listened to, only one was able to articulate why the free market can provide jobs for anybody that wants one. The rest of the kids, it was all the federal government has to do this. So how do we articulate a libertarian thought process to high school age kids when apparently all that they're getting is federal government, federal government, federal government? How do we do that?
Well, I think we need more libertarian teachers. We need more libertarian journalists. We need to stop this idea on the right, on the libertarian side, on the conservative side, that we need to create these secret libertarian conservative only societies, this Benedictine option, essentially, where we're going to create our own universities, create our own schools, create our own, charter schools, create our own newspapers. I think that has shown, that impulse by the baby boomer generation has really shown to be an ineffective strategy and led to some pretty nutty places. And listen, it's not like conservatives were pushed out of newsrooms, pushed out of universities. They felt they need to go somewhere else. But the fact is fight to get back into it. Fight for diversity instead of sort of this whiny, let's start our own thing and then just build a reputation based on outrage at hypocrisy. I just think it doesn't work. It's not compelling. It gets boring after a while hearing conservatives whine and bitch and moan about everything, and the kids are like the main place. But the fact is if you go back and read my columns as a junior in high school for the high school newspaper, it's pretty socialistic.
I think most high school students were kind of little Marxists running around.
Yeah, like there was, the government needs to do this or that, or that, it was all BS. It was stupid. But, kids are experimenting with ideas and other things. And our impulse to shelter them with that Benedictine idea of you need to just watch our culture. You can only watch this. You can only watch the Hallmark Channel. We need to protect you from the world. It makes fragile people, when they get out into the real world, they're not really prepared because they have not been exposed to different ideas. They've not been exposed to different cultures. They've not been exposed to how to handle problems because we have segregated ourselves into the suburbs. And oh, by the way, you're going to go to Hillsdale and you're only going to read the Daily Wire. So then when they get out into the real world, they become very bitter and angry people. And I think libertarians make a huge mistake when they try to do that self-segregation. And to your answer, it means that we need to encourage those people to I mean, I know this sounds weird, but stop setting up blogs and YouTube channels and Instagrams to control public opinion, but go get an education degree. Become a teacher. I mean, I saw Chard Reed, a teacher here in Indianapolis who taught economics at my school. He ran for Congress as a libertarian, one of the brightest people I've ever met. Great teacher at Heritage Christian. Now he's at Carmel, one of the wealthiest school districts in the state, as a business teacher. And his textbook is Peter Schiff's How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes. That guy's going to create way more libertarians than your libertarian podcaster or blogger or whatever. Like, you know, that the conservative in the newsroom that is contributing opinion pieces, like my friend Pete Seat is the conservative writer for the Indy Star. Like that him in that newsroom gives a conservative to bounce ideas off of. Like we have to stop segregating ourselves and trying to protect ourselves from scary communism, because I'll tell you what, once you kind of wade out of our own little Benedictine worlds, there's a lot of people who don't understand libertarianism, but are kind of curious now. When I started this podcast, I had to explain what a libertarian was and what it meant. And that's fewer and far between, you know. I mean, it's a different thing than people kind of think a libertarian's just sort of like a Republican, but with a little more racism,
or they call us a bunch of anarchists,
right? Or they, you know, there's a lot of misconception, and I think we do ourselves a disservice when we kind of check stuff out. We check out, you know, call your local school district and say, you know, I was supposed to do a couple speeches to high school classes, and the school districts didn't want that to happen because they didn't want the Libertarian Party to come in and infect the children. Which I was like, I'm not even in the party, but I'm a podcaster and this is my alma mater. Like, so it was just sort of like weird, but whatever, you know, so during this past election, I tried and it's hard to get in there, but I don't know what the answer is other than young people who have these beliefs, like that kid who's arguing for the free market, considering an education or a journalism degree, and having one libertarian in the school system that's not crazy is going to go a long way to getting people to open up and to think a little bit differently.
Well, and I think part of the solution too is just to have the discussion. You know, so much of our politics now is just vitriolic. You know, you don't agree with me, therefore you're the devil. Mm-hmm. And I think that people just need to cowboy up, I guess, and engage in that sort of debate and just have a free exchange of ideas. So I kind of want to move to a different topic here. One of the big problems that Wyoming is facing is we have a huge budget shortfall. These numbers are small when you probably compare it to the budget of Indiana. I think we're short about $200 million, which for Wyoming, that's a big number. Mm-hmm. And it's almost all of it is due to the drop in mineral prices. So roughly 60% of Wyoming's revenue comes from mineral royalties. Now, with the plans that I've read about the incoming administration, it's going to get worse for extractive industries: coal, oil, natural gas. So, what would be a libertarian solution to, you know, perhaps, I don't know, close that funding gap? Wyoming doesn't have a state income tax. Actually, we have some of the lowest taxes in the country. So if just giving you the Cliff Notes version of the budget problems, from a libertarian perspective, how would you approach that problem?
Because see, this is the kind of question that libertarians don't think about, because you want to get elected, you've got problems like this, because the most obvious answer is, how do you close a budget gap? You raise taxes, but we don't want to do that, right? We want to try and innovate our way out of this.
You say that in Wyoming and you'll never get elected.
No, good. Unless you're a Cheney, I don't know. Is that Wyoming? Are they from Wyoming?
Yeah, they have a ranch down in Casper.
Okay. I have to turn it back on you because I don't know a ton about the state. Like, what are some things that maybe have been talked about or that you might think of?
We'll get to my answer here in just a second, but first, some gratuitous self-promotion. You can find Cowboy State Politics on any of your podcasting apps, iTunes, TuneIn, Pandora. Pretty much anywhere you can find a podcast, you'll find Cowboy State Politics there. Don't forget about the website, cowboystatepolitics.com. All of the shows are on the site, as well as the show notes. Any of the articles that I've brought up during the program, you can find them there, read them for yourself. You can find the Chris Spangle Show on any of the apps that I mentioned. Also, check out his website, wearelibertarians.com. It's a great resource if you want to know what it is to be a libertarian. So now, back to the program. My personal opinion is that we could raise the state sales tax. And right now, I think the tax in town is 6%, but that's only because our community voted to raise it another penny. But if you raise the state sales tax, then everybody pays it. And regardless, if you go buy a car or whatever, you have to pay sales tax on it. And secondly, from a free market standpoint, it's entirely voluntary.
Sure.
If you don't want to pay that tax, don't go buy a new car and let the terrorists win. No, I'm just kidding.
Or go to Montana and buy one.
Right. Well, and that happens too. And a lot of people from here do their shopping up there because there's no sales tax. So I think if states, not just Wyoming, but would look at it from a sales tax perspective, I think that's one, a fair solution. Two, it would raise money. And three, it's entirely voluntary.
Sales taxes at the state level, those states tend to do better economically and get more investment. I mean, look at what's happening in Texas right now. I don't believe they have income tax and they have sales tax. I think is how they fund stuff, and they're getting every business from California. The reliance on a single industry for your tax base is really kind of crazy, and it is going to hit your state hard once Biden comes in, because there isn't going to be a lot of investment, and there is going to be, so for those listening, here's why it matters. Like, a state can't print money, and the federal government puts certain mandates on states that they must fulfill. Like, for instance, Medicaid, Medicare, through Obamacare, you have certain targets that you have to hit for all these different things. And so, you have to have taxes in this day and age with the government. It's like getting the federal government to shrink is the best thing we can do for state and local governments, because the less power they have, the less it's going to cost you on your local taxes, the local revenue, and less speeding tickets, because that's the best way that they have. It's the last way they have to raise revenue here in Indiana. So a lot of those unfunded mandates really hurt. And so, I imagine that your government, the next thing I'd think is cut. But I can't imagine that you have a big state government with a lot of big programs like a California. There's probably not a lot to cut there. I mean,
well, no, the places that are left to cut are programs that are dealing with mental health, for example. I'm doing an interview tomorrow with a group that they basically take in a whole family that's got, DFS issues, and, perhaps they're in the court system, and they work with the entire family.
Right.
Well, that program costs the state roughly $2 to $3 million a year, and they're on the governor's chopping block.
Right.
So really, the only places that are left to cut are going to hurt. And, because so much of our economy is based on coal, natural gas, and oil, and that money's drying up, so the revenue has to come from somewhere.
And you're probably right that the most fair is 0.5% raise in the state sales tax, and you'll probably cover that budget shortfall. But is your legislature going to do that?
No, our legislature is, well, let me just back up a little bit and kind of give you a Cliff Notes version of Wyoming. Most people in Wyoming are libertarians, but some of them don't know that they are, and some of them wouldn't admit it if they are. Right. But we're a very independent state, and actually, we're going to get in my next question. We'll get to more independence, but there is just an anathema to raising taxes here. And it's because, Wyoming is not a rich state, and most people that live here, unless you live in the People's Republic of Jackson, are not wealthy individuals. You know, it's people that own a ranch that barely scrape by. You know, so the only solution, not the only solution, but one of the only solutions that are left in raising taxes is going to hurt, just about everybody in the state. So speaking of being independent and
let me throw in before we move on to that. I mean,
go ahead.
What kind of in terms of encouraging innovation and tax incentives for new tech, or I know like Idaho has made good progress in kind of bringing in some of that tech industry, and I don't know how many of the Californians you want to import.
Not that many.
Right. So
I'm just kidding.
What about like Indiana has really tried to, like, we have Salesforce. They're the biggest employer in Indianapolis at this point, I think. What about encouraging more? You don't have the income tax, so this isn't as helpful, but more people paying that sales tax by getting more people to move to your state. I mean, has there been any discussion about kind of tax breaks for companies that want to move from one of these socialist states like Illinois?
Two things. There's a lot of industry that Wyoming would be a perfect fit for. We have low taxes, and a lot of communities have developed what they're calling tech parks. Probably the most successful one is in Sheridan, Wyoming, which is 30 miles north from where I live. Weatherby Firearms moved there. When a huge industry. So most communities have taken it upon themselves to find a spot for a business to move to, and they've upgraded the internet access, upgraded the infrastructure, water, sewer, those sorts of things. So there is incentive for companies to move here. The problem with Wyoming is finding labor. Now, one of the more interesting industries that's cropped up here is the hemp industry.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a guy here in town. He owned a flower shop, and he told me, well, this was a month ago. He told me that he's thinking of completely doing away with the pretty flowers and just doing hemp, because just his business alone can clear $500,000 a year. Now think about the tax revenue that's going to come from that $500,000 a year. And I think Wyoming as a state just needs to be more open to other types of industries. I don't know if it's tech or if it's hemp or what the magic bullet is, but they just need to be more open to inviting industries in so they can move from socialist Indiana or communist California.
Yeah. Oh, and this is a big strategy for almost every state. So there's a lot of competition for that stuff, and it's easier for businesses to go, I want to kind of be in warm Houston or Tampa versus Wyoming in the middle.
Yeah, it's not warm here most of the year.
Yeah.
So my next question, Chris, is one big, huge thing that's happening right now is our governor's mask mandate. And there have been protests. Now, you have to understand, a Wyoming protest looks nothing like a Washington, D.C. protest. It's usually like...
They're expected, not feared.
Right. It's usually like 50 or 100 people, but there's been a lot of pushback on his mask mandate. And one of the episodes I did, I think it was 2 weeks ago, covered it. But I'm curious, what feeling are you getting in Indiana from mask mandates or mandates in general?
It's probably not much different than your situation there. I mean, Indiana is a very libertarian state, probably more independent than libertarian. The state went for Obama in 2008. Like it's a blue collar state. It's an agricultural state still. Even though 20% lives in Indianapolis, it's still fairly conservative. The reality of all this is I'm not a COVID hoaxer.
Neither am I. It's definitely no joke.
Yeah, I think it's something to be taken seriously. I think it's something to adjust your behavior, and I don't think that like we can blame all of the shutdown, the government shutdowns for the loss of every business. I mean, people were not going to go to big events, and companies were not going to hold large events for insurance purposes and just out of common decency. And people, despite lockdowns, are still going to restaurants. People, I think what COVID has shown, what the pandemic has shown, is the American system is still a system where the government is fairly weak. And even when it tries hard to impose sanctions on people, it's still an individual's choice on how to act. And the harder the government tries to lock down, the harder the government tries to force a mandate of any kind, the more pushback it breeds, the more conspiracies we get out of it, the worse the outcome tends to be. And so, I actually heard Anthony Fauci talk about this on an interview with CBS, I think it was, and a podcast of theirs, and Major Garrett. And he asked him, are you for a mandatory vaccine? And he said, absolutely not. Because when you mandate a vaccine, you get a lot of backlash, and you end up not getting more, getting less people vaccinated because of personal liberty. And so the best way is to just persuade people and let them make that choice, and more people will make the right choice than won't. And there's just a certain portion of the population that won't take the vaccine. That's how I feel about masks. That's how I feel about, all of this. I mean, the NBA and the NCAA shut down like 2 weeks before Trump came out with the CDC guidelines. That was the cover for all of these states to shut down. They were doing what was in their best interest and the best interest of their customers 2 weeks before the government decided that it could horn in on this and try to take credit or blame. People were going to adjust their behavior. They were going to do things differently, and they were going to be responsible about it. And this is like, uncertainty is the biggest killer of economic growth. And the pandemic has been a big driver of uncertainty, but it's also driven a lot of innovation. There's a lot of businesses and nonprofits that have innovated. And obviously the free market worked really well in cranking out the vaccine. And, we should be celebrating some of that innovation and the response to the free market, while illustrating that the government is taking 9 months to get you $600. They're incompetent, they're impotent, and they can't really save you from anything. They can't. We have this myth that the government somehow is needed to protect us in times of crises. And all that government at the state, local, and federal level has done is increase the amount of uncertainty. Like, event companies didn't totally just shut down through 2021 because of COVID. They also shut down because they didn't know what the rules would be in different states and cities. And so they're going to be slower to restart when it's safe to do so, because there will still be all of these rules and regulations across the country that they can't, it becomes a compliance issue. They don't have the time and energy to do that. And so these governors are really making a huge mistake. And one, creating more backlash. Two, that resentment causes bad actors to act worse. And then, those bad actors go, if it weren't for the government, I wouldn't do this. And then you just go, okay, well, then you're proving the point that government's necessary. Like, just do what's in the best interest of the community, and other people won't see you as the problem and go, yeah, maybe we need the government to force these people to do what needs to be done. So I think libertarians by and large have kind of made the wrong argument across the board the entire time by saying this is not that serious. We don't need to overreact. We don't need masks. They don't work. Like, all that stuff is just so counter and foreign to the majority of the population that they see them as followers of Alex Jones, and then they kind of write them off as them. But the message that was working and will work and people grab onto is that, yeah, this is serious, but it just is made worse by government causing more uncertainty, causing bad actors to act worse. And it's a liberty issue, so people still care about liberty. They still care about their freedoms. And that becomes the issue that they're fighting, instead of whether or not to wear a mask for personal protection.
Well, what you just explained is such an important point, that most people, given the opportunity, will do the right thing. Because we are by nature self-interested, and if they're just given the chance, they're going to make the right decisions. For example, I'm a type 1 diabetic, so it doesn't make a lot of sense for me to go hang out in a busy bar. Right? Because I could get really sick and probably, I might die. So because I'm self-interested, I make the choice not to go down to the local bar, which interestingly enough we call the Star Wars bar. But I'm self-interested, and I'm responsible for my own choices. And I think that you're absolutely right that libertarians made the 100% wrong argument. It should have been based in liberty. That is, your life, you are responsible for your life and the choices that you make, and you ought to make the one that's best for you and your family.
Right. And I think it just comes down to a lack of trust of other people, and libertarians trust other people less than most other groups. And I think it's partly because we swim in this stew of here's all the horrible things that happened and government's responsible. Like, it's not a very hopeful movement a lot of times. And I think that kind of cynicism and negativity kind of overtakes, and we end up missing out on the good stories of the empathy and the caring for our fellow man. That really, libertarianism is attractive when you start talking about that stuff. That, look, the nonprofit sector has exploded in the last 50 years, and that is because people are empathetic, and when they hear a sad, tough story, their empathy is triggered and they'll fund it. Global poverty has been cut in half since 1990 because of free markets. There is a path to solving a lot of this misery, and we have to make that case. And it's something that I try to do, and not always effectively, but I mean, that's really where my heart is and why I do things like the radio shows, because you just see the empathy that people have for others, the care that people have for others, the biggest challenges in our society are being taken on by nonprofits and for-profit companies, and it's done effectively. And sometimes the government helps in some of that with funding. A lot of times it's just in the way. But at the end of the day, the progress that is made in solving some of these big societal issues are done by nonprofits, universities, and the private sector. And I think COVID and the pandemic are a huge part of that. You've seen great innovation take place through the pandemic, and in all these different places. You've seen acts of heroism and people taking care of each other. And, when you talk to food banks here in Indianapolis, the 12th largest city, they go, we've never wanted for food. Like, our need has doubled to quadrupled at times, but we've never not had enough because companies and individuals stepped up to make sure that everybody got fed. Those are great stories to tell. Those are great wins. And we should not be afraid to talk about that instead of, which I think is a depressing message, in that, Pfizer is trying to kill you for profit and all your friends are starving because of the government. I just don't think that's a very hopeful message, and I don't think it's a winning message.
Well, and I think that it's a classic example of where when individuals are given the chance, they will help out each other. I mean, what's more efficient, my mom making a casserole and taking it across the street and setting it on, next to the mailbox, or waiting for a $600 check that's not really going to help you at all.
Right. It's fairly ineffective. I mean, the government has done nothing but hurt. I mean, other than the one place that the government, in my mind, was effective is that it promised to buy a lot of vaccines that gave the funding to these companies to innovate. They got out of the way in terms of the FDA clearing some of this stuff. But we wouldn't be in the mess in America if it weren't for the FDA and the CDC completely blowing testing in the first 3 months of this thing. We would not have had the economic downturn had the Trump administration, the HHS, the CDC, and the FDA blown it and made all the wrong decisions in March, April, and May. I mean, it cannot be understated how perilous that was for this country and how many people that killed and how many people that put out of work because people didn't have the basic information of whether or not they were positive. Like, if you had a positive test in your hand, your behavior is going to be wildly different for 2 weeks than if you don't know. And
exactly
so
right.
Not having testing really until midsummer is what destroyed the economy. It was not just the governors locking stuff down, but it was really that failure at testing and people not having the information to make the right choices, because you're right, they're self-interested. Give people all the information, they'll make the right choice 9 times out of 10.
Well, my last question I have for you, Chris, is, and I think this is going to be perfect, and I'm going to use it to kind of make a point. Now, in the last 45, 50 minutes, you and I have agreed on just about everything. However, the one big thing that you and I do disagree on is Trump. And I just want to explain to everybody that's listening that, you know, we can have a discussion where we agree on 80% of just about every topic, and yet we can still have an intelligent discussion, even though we disagree on that 20%. So here's my last question. So one of your previous episodes, the main aversion you expressed with Trump is that he's a giant jackass, which I'll admit he can be a jackass sometimes. So, but if you look at all the things that he got accomplished, in my opinion, libertarians should love it. You know, originalists on the Supreme Court and all of the federal courts, lowering taxes, decreasing regulation. You know, in my opinion, libertarians should love all of the things that Donald Trump has done. Why don't you?
Well, if it were as simple as he's just a jackass, then I wouldn't feel the way. I mean, my opinion on Donald Trump up until COVID was 180. You know, I felt that he wasn't given a fair shake. I felt that he was misunderstood. I wasn't for him being impeached. And really through this summer, I saw that I was wrong and his opposition was right. I mean, I think his behavior through 2021 sort of exposed to me how deep his impulse for self-protection is, to the point that it will put others at risk, including the country. I don't think that he is a person that cares about liberty. I think he cares about what is good for Donald Trump. And I don't believe that person, yes, the things that like the vaccine, good. Breaking the fever for interventionism on the right, good. Those are good things. The tax cut, lowering the corporate interest rate, that's good. But every time the guy got a win like that, it's like one step forward, one step back. You know, the tax
kind of fumbled
cuts,
the ball.
Yeah, the tax cuts get erased essentially by the tariff. So $1,200 a family get tax cuts, $800 a month extra in tariff fees. You know, I don't consider Kavanaugh to be a win necessarily on the Supreme Court. I do think Gorsuch and ACB are a win. But I think Kavanaugh on personal liberties is a disaster. You know, so for every Gorsuch, there is a Kavanaugh. You can go down the list of every one of Trump's wins, and he shot himself in the foot because he's transactional. He's not an ideologue. He doesn't have a set of founding principles. Now, in some ways, that would be good. Normally, you know, and he's incredibly tough in taking criticism. So he doesn't mind moving the embassy. He doesn't mind moving to building a wall. He doesn't mind doing these things that, you know, I agree or disagree with, because he just doesn't really care. Like, and in some ways, libertarians are attracted to that lack of give a crapness. I don't know what you call it. But that often doesn't benefit liberty. You know, I think I really, for the first time, was disgusted with Trump, with the kids at the cages, where you have now 1,200 orphans that the United States government created. It doesn't matter what president is doing that. If you had the kind of conditions that were happening there, and the separations that took place, like, it doesn't matter who the president is. That's horrendous. That's one of the worst things the federal government has done in my lifetime. And there's that gives a crap attitude didn't curb his behavior. He doubled down on it. So that's where that kind of attitude backfires. He doesn't take that criticism and then take it in and think about it and try to change policy, because at the end of the day, he really views his position as Roy Cohn and the mob boss who, when you walk in, if he didn't get his way, he's going to hit you with a baseball bat. You know, I mean, he said that in interviews, that's sort of how he views power. It's his way or the highway. He's perfectly willing to create his reality, and you have to live in it and accept his reality or else. Like, and I think he's a very poor leader. I think he is a very obstinate person. And when you are at the head of a government that has life or death decisions for people, you really need to have the mental flexibility to take criticism and maybe consider that you're wrong, and I really kind of started changing my mind. The moment that made me go, maybe I'm wrong about Donald Trump, was when he gassed gassed people to get the photo op to, as an evangelical Christian, he's basically using my religion, using a church and a Bible to try and manipulate me into thinking he's on my team, and he was willing to hurt people to do it, and then starts talking about releasing the 82nd Airborne on American citizens. And I just went, this guy is not good. And what is, when you have somebody who really can't be controlled, can't be thoughtful, is going to do whatever he wants to do. Yeah, he's got non-interventionist tendencies, but if Donald Trump won a second term and he felt that it was in his interest to start a war with Iran, as he was talking about in October, like, he'd do it. Like, there isn't a set of principles like a Rand Paul that he's operating from. He is just about holding on to power, and that's really kind of the fundamental opposite of what we believe as libertarians. Like, the rule of law matters more than the rule of man. Like, just because we like this guy and we like his machismo, it doesn't mean that we should just bend down and make excuses for everything that he does. I think he has been incredibly harmful to the minds of the right. And I think that we have taken on these grains of truth, like the media is biased, that government is corrupt. And he has used some of those as tools to wipe away any bad intent or bad deeds that he's done. Like, he doesn't do anything wrong because the media is against him. Well, no, that's not the truth, because any president does something wrong. Any president has corruption or scandals in their administration, and he never could be held to account for anything.
Well, except if you're Barack Obama, there was not a hint of corruption there.
Right. I mean, right. Like, you need opposition because you need, like, the opposition to point out Fast and Furious, and you need them to point out Benghazi. We all know what happened in Benghazi, and it sucks that the media they wiped that away as a right-leaning conspiracy theory, because it wasn't. We all know what happened. But I just look at pure power politics, and I go, just because I have a coalitional instinct for the right, and I secretly would prefer Republicans to be in power than Democrats, it doesn't mean that I should allow that instinct to go, okay, well, you guys should have all the power and the left should have none of the power, because I don't think that's the right way. I don't think that's the Constitution. I'm a constitutionalist. Like, Trump, if anything, has made me more of a constitutional conservative, in that I now see the importance of private institutions, the importance of the constitutional system, because I've seen him try to test it and I see it hold up. And I appreciate the Republican form of government, small r, more than ever before. And as an anarchist at heart, but a constitutionalist in practice, I just can't look at a guy who thinks that he should have power no matter what. No, he'll make up, no matter, he'll lie about it, he'll cheat, he'll steal, he'll change whatever laws. I can't get on board. Like, I believe in the rule of law. Like, there should be set rules for people who have power, and they should be followed. And when they don't follow them, they should be impeached. They should be put in jail. And Donald Trump and many people in his administration don't think that the rules apply to them. And you know why? It's because they really haven't. Like, what has Donald Trump really been held accountable for? Like, nobody takes the Democrats seriously. And this is the importance of in-group policing. Everybody expects Nancy Pelosi to be against Donald Trump. Nobody expects the Republicans to be against Donald Trump. So when a Mitt Romney comes out and says this is not appropriate, it carries more weight for a while. I mean, eventually, if he's always against him, now if Mitt Romney says Trump is right on something, that's the big news. But like, it is important. There has to be some opposition. That balancing of tension is really what the American system is about. There's always going to be opposition, and you got to balance that tension out.
And I mean, the history of American politics is, well, not just the history, but I think the whole point is that it's supposed to be raucous. I mean, it always has been. I mean, you could make a credible argument that most of the Constitution was decided upon in a bar across the street from Independence Hall.
Right.
And for me, I'm more results based when I look at it, and what's best for me, what's best for Wyoming, and a lot of the things that have come out of the Trump administration have been fantastic for me and Wyoming. Now, I will agree that I don't think that there's an ideology that's at work with the Trump administration. I mean, he really is a businessman, and having worked in a couple of big businesses, they're all transactional in nature. I mean, it's what's best for the business. So I will agree with you there. But the cutting of regulations, freed a lot of people in Wyoming, companies in Wyoming, to really do pretty well. You probably haven't heard about this, but one big sticking point in Wyoming is about sage grouse. They're this little bird, and they're
but tell people, because I've heard of this.
Well, it's the sage grouse. When they breed, they have a strutting ground. It's actually kind of cool to watch, and really the strutting ground itself is pretty fragile. Like if you were to drive a car through it, well, the sage grouse aren't going to come back, and they're not going to breed there. But where we run afoul of that is when groups like the Sierra Club, or you can probably pick any liberal environmental group, and they've talked about sage grouse, is they take it to an extreme. So now the law is you can't do anything within a half a mile of one of these little strutting grounds, which is just ridiculous. Animals adapt, and I've got a stack of pictures that'll show you sage grouse eating off of a well pad. So reductions in environmental regulations, while they're painted by the big time media as, oh, we hate the environment, we want to trash the place, that's not exactly true at all. In fact, most companies, they want to do things the right way, because it costs a lot more money to fix what you screwed up.
Right.
So most companies will be responsible, and what the Trump administration was able to do was decrease those regulations, not eliminate them completely, because that would just be irresponsible, but to allow companies to do the work that they do to make money. And that's been really helpful for Wyoming. But that's just one example. So for me, I look at I'm kind of results based when it comes to Donald Trump. I think that he can be a giant jackass sometimes, admittedly, as we're seeing right now. But the whole point I wanted to make to our audience is that you and I agree on probably more than 80% of things, and we disagree on the big national the national issue of Trump versus Biden. But yet we're still able to sit down and have an intelligent conversation, and perhaps come to some sort of maybe it's possible that we could come to a solution by focusing on the things that we agree on. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I don't hate Trump supporting people. Like I get it. And I just don't like the argument for Trump is, but the left, but that's just not the scope that I'm using. It's, is he effective, and is he libertarian? And he falls
He's
too
not a
far
libertarian.
short. He's just not a libertarian. And on regulations, let me just say this, like on the regulation stuff. Yes, there is this idea that Trump has been a great cutter of regulations, and that is absolutely true, and that's one of the good things. But because he is uninterested in the job, and he is uninterested in understanding his role as president or how his agencies work, he has let a lot of these positions atrophy, and he never ended those positions like he should have in this interregnum period. Like he should be shutting down as much of this stuff as possible. Because if you read, there's a great book by Michael Lewis, the Moneyball guy, who wrote, it's called The Fifth Risk. And it basically was all about Trump's transition and how poor his initial transition was, and how that kind of got him off to a poor start. And Trump didn't fill out maybe like 25% of the government. And so there's been all of these positions that just have never been filled, or these jobs that never got replaced. And so he missed a huge opportunity to put his long-term stamp on the federal government.
COVID.
Excuse me. Yeah. I have a cold, and I'm just crying about regulations. But long story short, there's all these positions he didn't fill out. So now, instead of like 10% of those jobs to fill like a normal president, Biden's going to have like 40, 50%. And so the long-term ramifications of having a person that doesn't understand bureaucracy at the head of the government was not a net win in the long term, because now you're going to have long-term bureaucrats that are there for 30 years that believe like Joe Biden and not AEI or the Heritage Foundation. Excuse me. That's why I don't necessarily like, I just don't think that he was as effective as people would like to think he was.
Well, and I'm fair enough on that one, but I would be remiss in not plugging your website. One of Chris's mottos is sound smarter to your friends. And if you check out his website, there's a number of different podcasts that he's done that really do explain what it means to be a libertarian and elicits the mindset behind it. So you should really check out wearelibertarians.com and listen to Chris's show. It's really enlightening. He does a good job. So Chris, thank you very much for taking the time to come on Cowboy State Politics, and you're absolutely welcome anytime you want to come back.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, you have a good day, sir, and Merry Christmas.
You too.
Libertarians, in short, are the real conservatives in the room, though we've been led to believe that a different letter connotes who's a conservative and who is not. Most often, though, it's only that letter that distinguishes the two parties. Both believe in a more expansive and more intrusive government. Libertarians advocate for the smallest state possible that can still operate. It is private industry and private enterprise that solves most of our problems most efficiently, not the government. They usually just mess things up. Individual liberties are not guaranteed by the government, they are infringed on by it. And the only acceptable use of government coercion is to prevent actual harm to another person. If we're not harming someone else, the government just needs to leave us the heck alone. When you think about it, being a libertarian sounds a lot like just being from Wyoming. From the base of the Bighorns, in beautiful Buffalo, Wyoming, I'm David Iverson, and this is Cowboy State Politics.